Yeah. We can start with
Brother
you
Martin,
guys.
I'm volunteering you.
Oh, just be sure to unmute yourself, Martin.
Hi, y'all. My name is Brother Herman Johnson, Herman DePorres, and Brother Martin DePorres,
Martin.
schizophrenic in heaven. So I'm getting schizophrenic. But I'm Martin DePorres, and I'm so happy to be inserted in your world. I was born in 1579 and I lived for 60 years. I died in 1639. I lived in Lima, Peru at a time of great conquest. Just very briefly, imagine my city was a city that was in the great exploration for the resources, but at the servitude of the Indians and slaves. And this was the world that I lived in, and it wasn't a pretty world for a person like me. There was a negativity against dark skinned people. We were a rigid, severe, racialized culture, a hierarchy of races. The dignity of people was ranked with all kind of silly terms that exist down to today. Uh, Different levels of prestige from family lineage. And yet, despite that, I could go on about the horrendous atrocities against human dignity, but I found, or rather, I would say my life was a life of gospel joy, not a joy that was oblivious to the sufferings, but a joy that came from God, who is God. Despite the brokenness of his creatures, he remains the God of love and the God who honors and respects all people. And this was the God who hijacked my life and made me the great saint that I became, despite myself. I became a great saint, not so much by what I did, but what God did. Like the Blessed Mother in the I love the scripture passage where she said, "Let it be something was done to her." Something was done to her, and she said, "Let it be done to me according to your word." And she became a powerful witness to the gospel and to the resurrected Lord. And that's what my life was about. Not oblivious to the situation that I was in, but fully engaged in the world with the love of God. And I did that as a Dominican friar later on, which I'll tell you more about later. That's me.
Thank you, Brother Martin. I have to say, well, hi, my name is Saint Rose of Lima, Peru, the same Lima that Brother Martin lived, and we lived during the same time. So I just have to start out by saying that Brother Martin is literally the most humble person in the world. Like he says, it's nothing that he did. And obviously, God works through us, but he is one of the most remarkable people that I have ever met in my life. So I just wanted to start off by saying that you are too humble. Okay, moving on. Saint Rose. So that's what they call me, Saint Rose. And I lived like 400 years ago, and you think that people would kind of forget me. But as you see, there are still churches named Saint Rose of Lima around America and South America. And where I'm from in Lima, they still have this huge celebration every year on August 30th, my feast day, in which thousands of people crowd in Lima shoulder to shoulder for this humongous procession. They have a statue of me on that all these men are holding, and all day they travel from my little local church to the big cathedral, and there's huge bands playing, and at night they have fireworks, and it is a day of prayer. Now I don't need any of that. I don't really even care to be remembered, but there is one tradition that I absolutely love, and the people of Peru are welcome to write down their greatest desires of their heart, like what they want most in the world. Like what would you write if you had this card? And like any prayer requests, like just like what they really want God to answer, and they write it down on a card. And there's a tradition that they throw it into the well right next to my house. And I love that tradition because it shows that they know that I still care about them. When I lived 400 years ago, I cared about them. I cared about the people who came to me, and I prayed to Jesus on their behalf. And I still do that today. And I'm happy to be remembered in that way. Now, I kind of said not a lie, but I was a little bit misleading. I said my name was Rose, and technically my name that I was born with was Isabel, and I was named after my grandmother, and she was so proud that day. But soon, my kind of like nursemaid, I guess, saw that I had really rosy cheeks, and she started calling me Rosa, and that became a thing. And then soon after, my mom looked down where I was sleeping one day, and she saw a vision of a rose over my face, and she was so surprised. So from that point on, she started calling me Rosa. So that's where I get that name. Now, I am the patron saint of a lot of different things. I'm the patron saint of gardens. I'm the patron saint of florists. I'm the patron saint of the indigenous people of South America. And I am the patron saint of Peru. I'm also the patron saint of family troubles because my name was such a source of contention. My grandmother had been so honored that my name was Isabel. And then my mom comes along and changes it. And so as a child, one of my first memories was knowing that I was in trouble and not even knowing why. My grandmother was saying, Isabel, Isabel. So I went to see her. And then my mom was saying, Rosa, Rosa. And I turned to face her. And I knew that both of them were absolutely furious at me. And I didn't know why. And that was kind of my life growing up. I was kind of used as a pawn as my grandmother and my mother fought with each other. And one of the many things they fought about was my name. Now, I think part of the reason why my mom loved the name Rosa was because we lived in classes in Peru, in Lima, and we were part of the highest class of nobility that belonged to the Spanish. And there was nothing more famous than the Spanish rose. So I think she was very proud of that. Also, I was very beautiful as a child, and I was known as one of the most beautiful women in Peru and in Lima. And my mom wanted to kind of take advantage of that. Although we were part of the noble class, we had no money and we really had a hard time. So she thought that she was going to marry me off to a wealthy gentleman. And so we went to every social engagement, and she didn't hesitate to always put a garland of roses around my head for the effect that when I walked into a room, everyone would look at me because they thought I was so beautiful. And, oh, my name is Rosa, and I was wearing Rosa, like roses on my head. And it had the effect that she wanted. A lot of people wanted to marry me, but I felt completely objectified, and I hated it, and I cried every time she tried to take me to a party, and it made me kind of withdraw and start to develop myself in a way that I really wanted to be developed. I felt since I was a small child an intense calling to be with God, and so I buried myself in prayer. I created a little hermitage in my parents' garden where I could pray. I played the guitar beautifully, and I sang songs to Jesus, to the baby Jesus, who I was very devoted to. I did embroidery work that's famous in Peru. I don't know if you've ever seen the Peruvian embroidery. It's so bright and colorful. I was really good at that. And then eventually I started a garden with my best friend, Mariana, who was a servant of the household. She was an indigenous person, and she knew so many amazing things about growing a garden, and we created medicines for the poor. And that was the world that I wanted to be in so desperately, like serving people and serving God. But my mother and my family was constantly urging me to marry, and I kind of got caught in between, which I'm sure we will hear more about as we talk a little bit more. But I definitely always felt stuck and not didn't really know what my future would be. I don't know if anyone's ever felt that way, but that's the way I felt.
Thank you for sharing. Brother Martin, what about the Dominican way of life drew you want to become a follower?
Well, the Dominican Priory was in visual distance from my house. And as a little bitty boy, I had a sensitivity to my spiritual or my spiritual connection, that somehow I was created by a God who loved me, a God who wanted a relationship with me. I was aware that somehow, despite the fact I was told I was an intelligent little boy, I was a bright little boy, I had an awareness that the Holy Spirit was really going to tell me what my life was about. And so this attraction to these men wearing white habits and singing drew me closer to them and drew me closer to the God that was within me. It was the crucified Christ who they adored and embraced. And so I was lured there. I was 15 years old, and at that time in my life, you you thought about an adult way of life, and it was a 300-room priory that took two city blocks, and one entry into the Dominican life was I needed a job. I had skills that the monastery could use. I was a barber, and also part of the duties, allied duties that a barber had was I bled people, meaning that was a procedure to deal with diabetes. I had medicinal practices that my father had given me that was useful for the monastery. So I was welcomed into the monastery as a Dominican, but with a status. There was a different hierarchy of status. I was called a donatus. In translation, I mean, I was a gift to the monastery. I had room and board. I had a room off the pantry right near to the back of the monastery where the poor could come without obstructing or interfering with the monastic horarium of the house. So I lived in the back of the monastery, facing 2 blocks from the river where the slaves were sold. The slaves were presented for auction, etc. And yet I had access to them in terms of healing, compassionate listening, and just serving their needs. Um, and after 9 years of doing that, somehow there was a rule from Rome that no religious order, this was not the particular faults of the Dominicans, but it was a decree from Rome that declared only pure-blooded people could be a religious. Therefore, that ruled me out. The church was uptight by the way I was conceived. I was conceived in the loveless sex act by a Spaniard and an enslaved woman. I looked the way I looked. So the church, I was illegitimate and completely barred. There was no possibility I could entertain being a Dominican brother, let alone a priest. No possibility. I was not raised conceiving that that was a possibility for me. But yet there was a place for me among the Dominicans who I had come to love. And they came to love me. They came to love me because I was infused with the love of Jesus. And that's what I transmitted to others, the life of God to others. What what did I transmit to them? The healing love of God. And the fact that I saw dignity in even mangy dogs, the mice of the monastery. I just I was just so transformed with the Jesus. My relationship with Jesus was one big lifelong of gazing, a fusion of souls. And this was something that I couldn't hide. I just could not hide. It was me. The love of God was me. And the Dominicans noticed this. And so after 9 years as a donatus, a lay helper, I became a Dominican brother. And that ends my story. I had 40 years of being of mirroring, reflecting God's love to everybody, even those who treated me not bad, who treated other people bad. I was filled with the love of God. And I loved St. Dominic. I loved all the Dominican saints. The Dominican way of life was a way for me to perfect the love of Jesus and his word.
Thank you for sharing. And Sister Rose, as a layperson, what about the Dominican way of life drew you to want to become a follower?
Um, well, as I had mentioned, when I was growing up, I was stuck in between. I had made a vow to God as a child that I would be his, but my parents knew absolutely nothing about it. And so they were constantly pressuring me to get married, but I was living out my vow already. I was going to church every day. I was going to confession often. I was receiving spiritual direction. I was praying. They knew how devout and devoted I was to God already. And, but my parents were insistent. They really wanted me to get married. Now there was this guy named he was the leader of Lima. He's the Archbishop of Lima, and his name was Taribo, and everybody knew him. He was famous because he was a true Catholic. You know, there are Catholics and then there are true Catholics. He was always advocating on behalf of the poor. He was visiting the different indigenous communities throughout Lima and trying to learn their language. He was advocating on behalf of the slaves from Africa. He was a good man. And somehow he noticed me. He had heard about me and my prayerfulness. And one day, unannounced, he showed up at my home. Now, my mom was at first delighted. It is such an honor to have an archbishop in your home. And he was a bit of a celebrity. And so my mom and dad were there. And then he asked to see me. And suddenly, you know, the eyebrows are going up on my mom. She's thinking, what's going on here? And so we're all sitting in the living room together. And he invites me to be part of the religious community that he was forming called the Poor Clares, which is a Franciscan order. And his niece was part of it, and it was very near and dear to his heart. I was so excited and honored, thinking that this man, who, by the way, became a saint, was inviting me to be part of this religious community. I just could have died and gone to heaven right then and there. And my mom became so stone-faced and livid, angry, and she calmly told him that um, I was too my grandmother was too attached to me, and we couldn't possibly let me go, or that they desperately needed the income from my embroidery work. And then finally she just said, Rose is getting married. And she basically tossed out the archbishop, the saint Archbishop Taribo, out of the house. And that was deeply upsetting to me, like, because this was my dream come true, and my mom didn't care at all about what I wanted for my life. She only cared about what she wanted for my life. So I got mad and I went to visit my spiritual director to see what he thought about this. And he went in a completely other direction. He said, you know, I think your mom is right. The Poor Clares, it's a new order. They're not very well organized. I think you should join the Augustinians. And he happened to know the prioress of the Augustinians. So he said, you know what? I bet they'll waive the dowry now that they know that the archbishop wanted you, and we'll sneak you up there early in the morning. And so suddenly this was the plan. And I was like, oh, okay. And I felt kind of bad that I was disobeying the archbishop, disobeying my mom. I was like, all right. And so my brother Ferdinando, he was going to cover for me. So we were sneaking out when it was still dark. And in those days, they left the church open. So I thought on my way, let me just check in at the church and say a quick prayer at Our Lady of the Rosary. And so Ferdinando, he was keeping watch to make sure that nobody found us. Because if we were caught, I wasn't going to be able to go to the convent. So I went in to pray. And Ferdinando, the way he tells it is he was waiting and waiting and waiting. Finally, like a half hour goes by and he storms into the church and he starts like basically yelling at me in whispered tones. He's like, "What are you doing? You are the worst at sneaking out. You said you were going to say a quick prayer." And so I told him, I was like, "Fernando, I can't move." He's like, "Yes, you will. Come with me right now." And I said, "No, literally, I am a statue. I cannot move. My feet won't move. I've been trying to move for 20 minutes." And I had said, asked for a sign from God. Is this God's will for me? And this was his answer. I really couldn't move. And so I promised him that I would follow his will, and perhaps I should not go to the Augustinian convent. And suddenly I collapsed on the floor and I was released. And that gave me a lot to think about, because I thought that this is what I was being called to do. I thought I was being called to join the sisterhood, to be a nun, to be cloistered, and to pray all day. But obviously, that wasn't the plan. And then I was thinking, marriage? Is that the plan? So I was so confused. So the next day, I'm in the garden in my house and I'm doing my embroidery work with my mom. Sometimes we'd work 10-hour days, just embroidering. And while I was making the beautiful design and all these beautiful colors, I said, "God, please send me a sign. I don't know what to do anymore. I know that you can send me a sign. I'm completely lost." And suddenly I looked up and I saw this beautiful butterfly. And it wasn't a butterfly I had seen before. It was white and it had black tips on its wings. And he just started almost flirting with me, circling around, circling around. And even my mom noticed. And she said, "Oh, Rosa, I think that butterfly is going to land on you." And then it did. It landed right on my heart. And in that minute, I just knew what Jesus wanted of me. And that was to join the Dominicans as a third order, as just a regular lay person. And their colors were black and white. And I was blessed. Like I was accepted. My mom was okay with it because I was a lay person. That meant that I could get married one day, which I did not, by the way. But she was okay with it, and I was very blessed by the Dominicans. Like we did have our ups and downs, um, but especially the early years were so wonderful. They were a great support of me, and it just goes to show, if you ask God for a sign, he answers. God is listening to us, and he gives us what we need.
Oh, what a beautiful story. Thank you. Um, so there were obviously many challenges going on during the time that you lived that needed attention. Brother Martin, do you think you could tell us about one thing that you felt passionate about that you felt you needed to address in your time?
One of the things I was passionate about, and it sprung from my prayer life, and that was the suffering of the poor, the marginalized of my time. In plain sight around the monastery was the suffering Indians, the African slaves, uh, the the just the poverty and the hunger that was all around me. And my role was to just treat everybody nice. That's a start. And yet at the same time, with that, I had skills. I had skills to. I hear today in your world, some people call me a doctor. I guess I was to the many poor. I was the poor. I was the closest to a doctor they had, because I did do lots of medicinal uh, practices. I engaged in a lot of herbal healing medicines for all kinds of infirmities, especially wounds, diabetes as we knew it back then. And I was preaching the gospel in the relational manner that I served people. I tried always to affirm their dignity and beauty as angels of God, that in the realm of God, we all were special. The hierarchy of dignity and specialness was an illusion. The Jesus I adored honored and respected all people. So, out of this relationship with Jesus, I developed a passion for the poor. I developed a love for the poor. I developed a love for my brothers who did not always live the radicality of the gospel. And yet I loved them also. I love serving the poor as a Dominican in the preaching charism of the Dominican order, by preaching in the relational manner that I cured and touched people.
Thank you. And Rose, you've talked a bit about some of the challenges going on during your time as well. What did you feel passionate about that you felt needed to be addressed at that time?
Well, as Martin has mentioned, that Lima was an absolutely terrible place. I mean, if we want to talk historically for a second, like I was born in 1586. It was only the 1530s that the Spanish people had come and conquered the Incan people, and with that conquest, they brought all the Spanish people brought these terrible diseases, so much so that their population was almost completely wiped out. Like the population dropped so much, and there was so much brokenness. And in the world that I lived in, as Martin said, slavery was legal. This was a common practice. There were thousands of slaves coming in, and they were hired to work on the sugarcane farms and in the cotton fields and so many other places. And on top of that, the indigenous population, what was left of the indigenous population, was required to work basically servant positions, but the worst kind ever. If you know anything about Spain, you know that they're famous for their gold and their silver, and that came from Peru. And so all of these indigenous people were forced to work in the mines. Now, these were terrible conditions, even worse, like mining is always terrible. But as part of the process of refining gold, of refining silver, of really purifying the metals, mercury was used. And so there was this giant mountain that was basically called the Mountain of Death, that these indigenous people were forced to work in. And it was a death sentence. After 2 or 3 years serving in this mountain, they would die. And it wasn't just men, it was women and children were forced as well. And these were the conditions that all of our money and wealth, like this is what our greed was costing. And the Spanish population was Catholic. They knew this was wrong, but they were told that it was a necessary evil. They were told that this was economically important for Spain, our motherland. And honestly, it was bull. Like, we didn't have to be doing these things. And so this was the sin that sat on Peru. This is the sin that sat on Lima. And so that's a lot for anyone just to deal with. Um, and 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 beyond that climate, there was the regular poor. Like, you guys have social services today. There was nothing like that. There was Martin, in the back door of the friary being like, who's hungry? And that's what he was in charge of. And that was inspiring. And he knew so much about these herbs and medicines. And that was inspiring to me. And I started to do something similar. I had that garden, and my friend Mariana and I, we boiled herbs together and we created balms and ointments together. And that was the physical manifestation of how I tried to help. But we needed to do a lot more than that. Like, this was just a drop in the bucket compared to what really needed to be done, but it was something. So in the midst of all that destruction, in the midst of all that death, I tried to cultivate like a pocket of life, like a pocket of peace in a beautiful garden that offered healing to the people who came. And there were lines out the door of people who showed up at my house every day, searching not just to be physically healed, but spiritually healed as well. And we would pray together and they would tell me their troubles. And that was my active ministry. But my true ministry was prayer, praying for the countless people who were experiencing so many problems in the world.
Thank you. I will like to open it up to questions. We have a few minutes left, and then we'll throw a final question out. But so if you would like to unmute yourself and ask any questions that you might have of our two saints, it's not every day we get to be graced with the presence of our saints. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question that you might have for Rose or Brother Martin.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it, Nicole.
It's for both of them. Like, if you have any like tips for manifestations and like getting what you want out to like God and Jesus. Like, what are some good tips to like have an outcome that like you want?
I'm not understanding the question. What do I have tips for what?
For like better like preaching out to God for like something that you want to happen in your life.
Oh, like tips on how to petition God. Okay, well, that's easy. In the Bible, it said, ask and you shall receive. And that's how God works. I know in my life, anytime I break down and start crying, that's when God works the best. Because it's something that I'm like really passionate about. And I really do feel like Jesus doesn't like to see us cry. But in the Bible, it's very plain that God just wants us to have an ongoing conversation with him. And if we really beg him for something, like he's our friend, he'll give us the answer. It might not always be what we really like wanted in our heart, but he'll definitely answer our prayer. And Brother Martin, I'm sure he has a lot to add.
Yeah. Today's gospel answers that question, set for Wednesday, May 26th, when they said to Jesus, they said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And Jesus says, "What do you wish me to do for you?" And it's what Jesus responds by saying in the end in this gospel, basically what we want is peace. It's not like we want God to be on our side and give us all of our mundane desires, but he wants us to drink of the chalice and to participate in his life of love. And that may not be on our wish list, but in the end, what we want is really peace. Even if you name a particular thing, in the end, you want peace. So he engages in a dialogue and they tell him what they want him to do, whatever they tell him. But he tells them, you do not know what you're asking. So sometimes we don't know. God knows what's best for us. And he will give us the very best if we really open.
Any other questions for our lovely saints here? We got a few more minutes.
We have a question from Deanna Edgewood. Hi. I am aspiring to become a nurse, And my question, I guess, goes towards Martin. How does my role in that field contribute in combating racial injustices in the world?
Good question. You know, the contemporary issue of racism in your world is an overwhelming problem. It's illuminated by the social media that you have today. We're rightly and gratefully more aware of racial injustices. So you can be a response that you and each individual on here can make. It can be overwhelming. Uh, don't unrealistically feel overly responsible for it, but you do have a role in simply within yourself, first of all. Always take inventory and review how you're a part of a racialized world, you yourself, and always confront whatever you find in yourself with trying to always respect and see the dignity and beauty of everybody you meet, especially people who traditionally are not in your world. As a nurse, you're going to be meeting a lot of people, and you may be socialized to think of people in a way that has nothing to do with who they really are as a human being. But just get to know people and find out that just discover their dignity and treat people nice. That may sound like a sweet little package deal, but that's the best we can do. And that's powerful on each person on an individual level to make a response in this crazy racialized world, to just always be at the forefront of taking personal inventory of who you are in a racialized world and how you're going to try to live the radical call of the gospel, to go against the tide, to always respect people, to pray to see the beauty in people who you were socialized to see as ugly. You know, little basic things like that. Be open to do an examination of how this racialized world has affected you.
Thank you. And thank you for your question. That was really powerful. Just like 1 minute left. Let's just. Do you have any final pieces of advice for our young people who are, spending this week learning about how we can be preachers and how you can overcome obstacles that might face us in our time today, much like we were just talking about? So, any advice for these young people as they continue on their journey this week?
Well, my hero was St. Catherine of Siena, and my favorite quote of her is, "Be who God made you to be, and you'll set the world on fire." I think God isn't asking anything of us that we don't already have inside of us. And when you partner that with prayer and a relationship with God, you can see that even the ordinariness of life can become absolutely miraculous. And I think that there are a lot of amazing young people here today. You are so gifted, and God will do amazing things with your life. So thank you in advance for that.
And I would like to echo Catherine of Siena too, following with Rose. I was thinking about that, Rose, too. Catherine of Siena teaches us that, shows us, it was revealed to her uh, as a mystical theologian, that all of you young people on here are very beautiful. You really are. I'm looking at you. And God needs your hands, your feet, your wisdom. God needs you, your body, to be his love in the world. Take that serious. You, you are very important to help people understand who God is.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So, with that being said, we have concluded our meeting today. Thank you, Rose. Thank you, Martin. It
Thank
has been an
you.
absolute
Thanks for
pleasure
having
having
us.
you. And we look forward to seeing everyone back in the main room. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. God bless.
Adios.